Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our discussion of various informal fallacies. Here, we're going to start talking about the fallacy of equivocation. This is a fallacy of irrelevance insofar as different premises or terms, different concepts, you might say, when someone is using these key terms, concepts, or phrases in a way where the meaning is changed or the truth value changes from one premise to another. And insofar as this happens, it hinges on ambiguity. And the reason why is because the premises are supposed to provide support for the truth of the conclusion. But if some term shifts its meaning, if the truth value changes from one premise to another, then it's not going to be able to provide support for the conclusion. Truth will not be preserved in the conclusion. It's another way we can put that. So, really, what happens here is it's a kind of semantic sleight of hand. And sometimes this happens on purpose. Sometimes people are explicitly doing this. But I think a lot of times it doesn't happen intentionally. I think sometimes we have to pay close attention to how we're using different terms or what the actual meaning or truth value of those terms are, because it may not be immediately obvious. We may not immediately be able to tell. And I think that's actually very common. And since that's a bit tricky to figure out, let's look at an example that I hope will help here. So this example actually comes from a pro-life argument, probably an argument you have heard of at some point, or at least some version of this argument I'm guessing you've probably come across. It begins with the premise that says it is wrong to kill an innocent human being, right? That seems true. It's wrong to kill innocent human beings. Premise two then says, well, a fetus is an innocent human being. And then, if you accept those two premises, they both kind of seem true, they seem plausible, then it would seem to follow that it is wrong to kill a fetus. Therefore, abortion is wrong insofar as abortion just is the killing of a fetus. But notice what's actually going on here in this argument. Again, an argument I think that's very common. It's the sort of argument that a lot of people might accept. But what's actually happening here has to do with the term human being. What do we actually mean here by human being? On the one hand, in the first premise, it looks like the term human being actually means something like person, like a part of the moral community here, right? So it would clearly be wrong to kill an innocent person or some member of the moral community. And so that seems to suggest that there's a moral meaning that's assigned to the term human being in the first premise, right? It's wrong to kill a human being because there's some aspect of being a person involved in being a human being. So the word human being here has a moral meaning behind it. The word human being just means person in the moral community or a person with a moral status, you might say. So, really, we should interpret that first premise as saying it's wrong to kill something that has a moral status. But what about the second premise? Now, here in the second premise, it looks like the word human being is actually referring to membership of the human species or membership in the Homo sapien species, right? So that's very different from being a person or a part of the moral community, something with a moral status. So then, where the first premise is using the word human being with a moral meaning assigned to it, the second premise is better understood in a biological sense, where we're talking about something that has a certain kind of DNA. Human beings have a certain kind of DNA that make them a part of the Homo sapien species, right? So we've got this very explicit biological meaning that's assigned to the term. So we've got the word human being used in both premises, but they have different meanings assigned to them, different sort of truth values assigned to them. And what that means is when we slide between these two different meanings of the word human being, the truth of the different premises will change, such that it's not going to be clear whether or not the conclusion's going to follow. And that just means that it's unclear whether the premises actually provide support for the truth of the conclusion. So this is a case of equivocation because what we have is a case where we're sliding between two different meanings of the word human being. And as a result, it turns out that the truth value changes as well. And it becomes unclear whether the premises are going to provide support for the conclusion. So it's possible that the conclusion could be false, even though we accept the premises. In fact, you could imagine a situation where there's a human being that may not be a person. Imagine, for instance, an irreversibly comatose patient where they still count, biologically speaking, as a human being, But if they're irreversibly comatose, right, they no longer have a mind, let's say. They're not rational. They're not a rational agent. They're not able to think for themselves because they're a comatose patient. Well, it's not clear that they're going to be a person in the moral community anymore. Or we might consider someone like a very young infant, a newborn baby, right? They may become a person, but it's not immediately obvious that they are a person. But I think everybody would accept that biologically speaking, a young infant, a newborn baby, still counts as a human being in that biological sense. So it looks like there could be a human being in the biological sense, but not in the person sense. Indeed, we can say the same sort of thing about a fetus. A fetus could count as a biological human being, but not as a person. And once we realize this, we could also infer that it's possible to be a person that's not a human being. Just imagine, for instance, a dolphin. Dolphins are very intelligent creatures. Maybe a dolphin is going to count as having a moral status in some sense. So a dolphin might be a part of the moral community or a person in some particular sense, but clearly a dolphin is not a human being, a part of the Homo sapien species. And we might say something similar about elephants. Elephants are also very intelligent creatures, but they're not human beings. They may be a person, but not a human being. And we could conceivably think of like an alien species, some Martian that's out there. Clearly, it's possible that you would have a Martian, or maybe someone like Spock, who counts as being a person, but not a human being. And if these sort of situations are conceivable, and it seems like there's some plausibility behind it, then we've got a situation where we're equivocating between two different premises on this word human being, where human being means biological human being in the second premise, and person, this moral sense of being a human being, and the first premise. And since they're shifting between these two different meanings, then that gives us a good reason to reject the argument. So now let's turn our attention to another very common kind of fallacy, which is called appeal to popularity. Sometimes this is called the bandwagon fallacy because we're sort of getting on the bandwagon here. This fallacy occurs when you believe that some claim is true simply because the belief is popular or that claim is accepted by a large number of people. The fallacies very closely tie to some of the obstacles that we considered in the previous module, different problems or errors in thinking that we saw back in chapter 2. Now, one of the things that I want to mention and call your attention to is that this is actually hyper problematic in different online spaces or on social media. And what I mean by this is that online and social media, these different platforms actually amplify the problem, right? When we use things like likes or shares, when we've got trending topics or viral posts, different things that people find popular online that are going to be widely endorsed by many different people. This puts pressure on us. This puts pressure on you to accept those ideas because they're widely accepted online. And you tend to do this without ever thinking about it, certainly without evaluating whether the claim is actually true or false. This is just a common thing that happens. And the reason why that's so problematic is because when this happens, it definitely spreads misinformation and it reinforces these sorts of echo chambers, or it encourages a kind of herd behavior where people end up believing things simply because everyone else does, rather than actually investigating and looking at the evidence to see whether or not these claims or these beliefs are well supported. Now, certainly, there may be cases where you like something, or there may be some trending topic, and that could be perfectly innocent. But it can also be extremely harmful, and that's why I want to call your attention to this. So let's take a look at some examples to help us think about this. Suppose somebody says that this new phone has over 5 million different views or different likes or whatever. So therefore, it must be the best phone ever. Well, clearly, it doesn't follow that it's the best phone ever or that it's even a good phone. All that it shows is that people are talking about it, that it's trending online. Or suppose you come across some post that's suggesting that, well, since everybody's using this brand of skincare, if it's that popular, well, it has to work. Well, no, that doesn't necessarily follow. Just because everybody's saying that the brand of skincare is popular, everybody's buying this particular brand, that doesn't mean it works at all. Or maybe you happen to notice that some movie has the highest box office for some particular weekend. Therefore, the movie must be amazing. But we can tell that that's not true. It's not necessarily going to follow. How many times have you seen a movie that everybody else seems to really like, but you didn't think was very good at all? Same sort of thing can happen when you're just watching Netflix, right? All my friends are binge watching some new show, so it has to be worth watching. It has to be worth spending the time to watch the show. Or everyone on Instagram is doing this diet, so it must be a healthy diet. Well, of course, these are not necessarily going to follow. Or maybe somebody says that this viral life hack has thousands of shares. Surely it has to work. Again, no, it's just the fact that you're sharing a bunch of things. The fact that some claim is popular online doesn't mean that that claim has any credit to it at all. Now, there's a similar sort of claim that's called appeal to tradition. This fallacy says something similar, but instead of the claim or belief being accepted because everybody else is accepting it, here the claim or the belief or the view is accepted merely because it's a part of one's tradition. Again, remember we talked about these sorts of obstacles to good critical thinking and different errors in our reasoning back when we looked at chapter 2. It just says, well, we'll keep doing it this way because this is how we've always done things around here. But of course, tradition, like any group of people, can be wrong, and it has been wrong in many different ways, right? Tradition can be fine to some extent, but tradition itself can't tell you whether something is true or false. All that tradition tells you is that that's what you've been doing. It doesn't give you a reason to believe anything. It doesn't make any particular belief rational. And again, we have lots of examples where tradition has been very problematic. Consider, for example, cases of women's rights or civil rights or gay rights. In all these different cases, people argued against, women having the right to vote, for instance. Many people objected because it was a part of our tradition, and insofar as it's a part of our tradition, we should, continue doing it that way. But clearly, that's not true. Clearly, that would be wrong. Just because tradition at one point in time claimed that women should not have rights, or that black people shouldn't have rights, or that gay people shouldn't have rights, that doesn't tell us that it's the right thing to do. In fact, I think most, if not all of you, would agree with me that these traditions were wrong, that it was a good thing that we got rid of these traditions. All right, so now let's look at some simple toy examples to help spell out this particular fallacy. Imagine that you have somebody who says, our parents never used smartphones, so we shouldn't need them either. Well, it may be true that people a long time ago didn't have smartphones, but that doesn't tell us anything about what we should do with smartphones now. Or imagine you had a friend that says, I've always worn Nike shoes when I go running, therefore that's the best choice. Well, maybe you prefer Nikes, but the mere fact that that's your tradition doesn't mean that it is the best choice or that everyone else should do it. Or another sort of example that's very common in Christian churches and circles is to say, well, people have always prayed this way. This is sort of the way we do things in our clergy, so it must be the best way to pray. We know what's really the best way to pray. But of course, the mere fact that you've got some tradition that says this is how we pray in this church doesn't mean that anyone else should have to do it or that it's even the right way to pray. Or if your boss or someone you work with happens to say, look, our company has always used this software, so there's no reason to switch to a newer system. But there could be some better software. There could be a better way to do it that maybe it would be more profitable for your company. So you should not necessarily just stick to your tradition because that's the way you've always done things, especially if you want to make a profit. And if there was some system that would allow you to do that. So here's an example that I certainly sympathize with. Imagine you have some professor that says, well, I've always assigned a 10-page argumentative essay for this class, so that's what my students must write as well. But of course, the mere fact that you've always done things a certain way doesn't mean that that's the best way to do it, or that's the way that all people should do it, or that you should continue doing it that way. Maybe there are better assignments. Maybe there's better ways of evaluating and assessing students' understanding and comprehension of the material. And another sort of very common thing that I remember hearing back in the late 90s and early 2000s was when people used to say things like, and of course, sometimes people still say things like, marriage has always been between a man and a woman, so that's the way it should stay, right? We should not allow for gay marriage because our tradition has always been, such that it's between a man and a woman. But just because we had this tradition previously doesn't mean that that's the way it should stay. It simply doesn't follow. Or here's another sort of example that comes from politics. Maybe somebody would argue that since we've had the Electoral College for over 100 years, there's no need to reform it now. But if you know anything about the Electoral College, you know that it's a very racist institution. It's sort of born from a very racist place in our country's history. And so you might think that there are very good reasons to reform it or maybe just to get rid of it altogether. So the mere fact that we have had the Electoral College for, well over 100 years, that doesn't give us any reason to think that it's good or that we should keep it or that we should at least reform it in some sense. All right, so now then, in the next video, we will look more closely at appealing to ignorance, which is actually a very difficult fallacy to make sense of. So we'll need to spell it out in a bit of detail, and that's what we'll do in the next video.